Good morning. We're going to go over a little bit of Chapter 4 today, even though I'm not here, so we're going to go through some basic information in this presentation. You should have shared or turned in on Google Classroom your Chapter 4 assignment from last week. So last week was Earth Science Week, so in celebration of that, we are going to look at geology around us. So one of the days last week was No Child Left Inside. It was all about awareness of geology and being aware of the natural world. So in celebration of that, I'm offering an extra credit opportunity. You have a Chapter 5 quiz next week, and for bonus points for that, find somewhere in Frisco, or if you've traveled somewhere where there's evidence of geology or geologic formations, take a selfie with that particular formation or possible outcropping, whatever it is you found while you were traveling. There are places in Frisco that are not flat. That shows some variation in the geology, so if you can find it, take a selfie. You're going to turn it in to me by email, and it's worth bonus points on your Chapter 5 quiz. So you have until this Friday, October 21st, to turn this in to me. And here's an example of one I took a couple summers ago when I was in Colorado. I'm at Colorado National Monument, and that is about 100, 200 feet down off the end where my feet are. So that's what I mean by a selfie with the geology or finding some sort of geological variation in Frisco that's not flat. So Chapter 4 is all about fossils and biodiversity and understanding how species change over time. So here is a very brief overview of how life changed in Earth's geologic history. So we did the geologic time scale, and the oldest fossils are prokaryotic fossils about 3.5 billion years ago. We've actually found some to be almost 4 billion years old now, but they are microscopic single-celled organisms that once the Cambrian explosion of 540 million years ago, we had the explosion of multicellular life, which evolved into the kingdoms and species we see today. So Chapter 4 is all about how this happened and what is its importance in the environment. So to understand how any of this has happened, we look at fossils, which are the remains of ancient organisms. The remains themselves have been turned to rock or mineral. The fossil can be of the actual organism or of evidence of its lifestyle, like tube worms can leave behind their burrows, and that would be a trace fossil. But these fossils enable us to understand the biological evolution on Earth. Here's one of the earliest fossils in the Precambrian. These are stromatolites. Stromatolites were leftover material from algae. They were photosynthetic life, and they left behind these rock structures and formations back in the Precambrian 2 to 3 billion years ago. And this is one such example of the stromatolites. So natural selection, as you guys learned in junior high and in biology, so how species survive. Survival of the fittest is what people most associate with that. So it's important to remember that populations evolve, but not individuals. Evolution is a very slow process, especially the larger the species. Genetic variability is key. If you don't have a lot of variability in your genetics, if you don't have a lot of traits in your DNA, then the mutation to facilitate traits adaptations will be very slow. So having a lot of genetic variability is very important for a species to successfully evolve and survive. And the adaptation is the trait we see in the species that enables it to survive in its particular environment. And this all, of course, is dictated by its environment. So the alligator, related to a lot of reptiles that have been around for hundreds of millions of years. Alligators are a great example of a keystone species. This is one of the terms from Chapter 4. Keystone species are a very vital species in their ecosystem. Their day-to-day activity, their niche, enables the niches and survival of other species within their ecosystem. So for example, alligators, they provide the following service to their particular ecosystem. They dig gator holes to nest and so forth. Well, those gator holes will fill up with water and provide a micro habitat for aquatic species, including insects, small fish, snakes, turtles, etc. So other species will use these gator holes as either a water supply themselves or as a habitat. Alligator mounds for nesting sites or feeding sites for big birds or some of the other reptiles in the ecosystem. Going back to gator holes real fast, not nesting holes for gator holes. They're more or less areas where they'll dig out to cool off and things like that. Alligators love to eat gar. Gar is a predatory fish in aquatic ecosystems and will take out lots of herbivore fish, so keeping the gar population in check will help keep the other trophic levels balanced out so that one's not over-competing the other. So alligators provide that predatory service. They will also control bass and bream for the same purpose with the gar. And alligators moving through the swamp and through aquatic ecosystems help clear out vegetation that would otherwise take over, and that wouldn't allow other species to find their way to the river, stream, creek, or whatever the water source is there. This also helps clear out any chance of invader species coming in. So within the variability and diversity in the environment, we have different types of diversity. We have, of course, as we talked about, genetic diversity. The genetic material varies, and you see in this particular image of all these different snails in their genetic variability based on their shell color and structure. Then we have species diversity. At different biomes, which correlate to our solar insolation, we see different numbering of species. The number of species present dictate how many niches are being filled, which will come later with the functional diversity above. Then we have ecological diversity. We don't want the Earth to have just one biome. We have many different types of major biomes and subbiomes, and so we would want to keep that going. We don't want the entire Earth turning into a desert, or the entire Earth being a tundra, which is similar to a hot desert, and we wouldn't want the entire Earth to be a forest or any variation of grassland. Having that diverse ecosystems enable the biogeological chemical cycles continue to processing, recycling, providing us all of our resources. Then we have functional diversity, and this has to do with the niches and the flow of matter and the flow of energy, as we talked about food webs and food chains. If the species are present for filling their niches, then it's going to continue this cycling of energy and matter, which again keep all of the resources and things that we need most being recycled and replenished in the ecosystems and the environment itself. So speciation. First of all, we need to know what speciation is. As you should remember from biology, two species result from one species. And so the causes of speciation can be in any number of things. One of them is geographic and reproductive isolation. And then this can happen because tectonics, the continents moving around, and the continents moving also changing climate, both of those can cause some sort of isolation of species geographically or reproductively. And then natural disasters. Any number of natural disasters can separate species and therefore would not be able to successfully reproduce and carry through with one species they were in. So in this particular example from your book, the early fox population speciation occurs, and now you have the gray and Arctic fox because of geographical isolation. Part of that had to do with the Rockies forming back in the Mesozoic, separating the species, and so one migrated south and one migrated north, and now we have two different species that once came from one particular species of fox. Species loss, extinction. All the members of a species are gone forever. No sign of any of those individuals anymore. So background extinction is the natural loss of species over time in the environment due to natural disasters, climate change, and any of the number of asteroid impacts, anything that was beyond human control that has killed off species over time. And it's a very slow process. Mass extinction happens when something very catastrophic happened. Best example, the asteroid impact that killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Endemic species. These are species that are very, very sensitive to change. Endemic species are the ones who are quickly disappearing from Earth because of human activities. They are very sensitive to any change in their environment, therefore are the first to disappear. Any small variation in their temperature or habitat, their range of feeding and so forth will alter their zone of tolerance, which means they will die off very quickly. So directional stabilizing, diversifying natural selection. This isn't something we're going to be spending too much time on, but it has popped up on the test every now and again. It's something very specific that has been seen maybe once or twice in one or two questions, so just wanted to touch on it briefly. This is something, if you've been in AP Bio, you've probably heard more about. So directional natural selection, the trait that becomes dominant due to a response in its environment. So for example, the Arctic fox developed white fur because it's cold and there's lots of snow. That's a direct change that a dominant trait became present. Stabilizing, usually it's the intermediate trait. that becomes the dominant trait, and it's because it's trying to narrow down a more successful trait. So for instance, if you have black fur, white fur, gray fur would be the intermediate based on that particular environment, what the need is of the species. Diversifying, it's a more extreme trait or more successful, such as the white or the black, and the intermediate will disappear over time. So it may have to do with camouflage or something to that effect. That is the reason that the extreme trait will become more successful. And then bioinformatics, if you've never heard of it, it is a software program, a computer system, which computer models are generated based on statistics and biological data. And we can use this for studying ecosystems and predicting trends, monitoring the success and the health of species and their habitats. So it's a database. It's similar to GIS, if you've heard of global geographical information systems. It's a way of compiling a bunch of data into one place and then using it to study and keep track of things going on in the natural world. Species richness versus evenness. So diversity, species diversity is determined by how rich and even the ecosystem is. So what we mean by that, species richness, how many different species are present in a particular ecosystem or biome. And then evenness, how many individuals are present within that species. So if we're looking at a rainforest, you have thousands and thousands of species in the rainforest. However, it may not be very even. You may not have very many individuals within that species present. So the more rich and even, the more the healthier, if you will, the more stable that the ecosystem will be, because you have many individuals within that species, and then you have a lot of species fulfilling niches. If you are not very even, then that means that the species could possibly be very susceptible to extinction, because if they don't have very many individuals and some are killed off real quickly, then they're going to die and possibly go extinct. So this would be an example of a very rich ecosystem, but maybe not necessarily very even. And so this is has a lot of evenness. You see many individuals of these two particular species that you see of the tree and the ferns, but it's not very rich in the terms of the number of species present. Role of species, your niches, something again you've learned since junior high. So you have your ecological niche, the job of a species in its ecosystem. A bee is a pollinator, that's its niche. Mosquitoes, population control, spreads disease, that's its niche. Generalist species. So we are generalists. Humans can live anywhere on Earth in any type of climate. We do well, but we also have the intelligence and technology to survive. But there are other generalists, such as a cockroach. They have a very broad niche. Their niche can be fulfilled in any biome that they go to. Specialist. They only survive in a particular ecosystem, a particular biome. The lemurs, the panda, the polar bear. These are just very easy examples of specialist species. So specialist species also tend to be the endemic ones. So the trend or the common thing you're going to see this year, that we have a problem with our specialist and endemic species disappearing very quickly because we're altering their habitat. They're sensitive to change, and they only live in very particular areas and only have a very narrow niche. Native species are ones that normally live in our particular biome, and then non-native or invader species come into an ecosystem that's not their own. We'll get more in depth another day on these two. Indicator species, they are canaries for the environment. Birds are the best example of this particular type of species. Birds can be found in every biome on Earth. So if a bird population is not doing well, then that typically indicates that something's gone wrong in a particular biome or ecosystem. So indicator species help give us some sort of gauge of how healthy an environment is. Foundation species, similar to with succession, they help shape the ecosystem in which they live, and they're very similar to a keystone species. So in order to look at how diverse an ecosystem is, we can use various indices to do these calculations, and they can be very broad or very specific. The Shannon-Weiner Index is one example. It's a statistical tool that we use to take into account the number of species and individuals represented in that particular ecosystem. The value of the scale is 0 to 7, and the closer to 7, the more diverse it is. So that we look at the frequency of the species, or how many we see, and this is the particular formula that we'll use. We'll be practicing this on Friday. So here's an example. You have 5 species, and you have the frequency of individuals for that species. So we first total it up, and then we find the proportion of frequency. And this is what we would get whenever we do that. We then take the inverse proportion of this, and we'll be practicing this in class on Friday. And then once we multiply the two together, we get this value, and then we add them up, and then we have the index that we would look at. So in this particular case, since it's not close to 7, it's not a very diverse ecosystem, but there's only 5 species, so that would make sense. So right now, you are going to do a Kahoot quiz over Chapter 4. And then after that, you are going to be completing an assignment looking at the relationship amongst species in a particular biome and how their relationship and their niches are important to each other in order to sustain their survival. Don't forget, your Chapter 4 FRQ is due on Wednesday.